Welcome back to episode 22 of Posture Labs and Alignment Fundamentals. My name is Emma and I'll be guiding you through. In this series, we're covering the alignment basics for many common yoga poses. In this episode, we'll be covering standing splits. I don't think I've ever used the Sanskrit name for standing splits in a class, but it is Urdhva Prasarita Eka Padasana. I had to repeat that in my head multiple times before I did this video because I seriously don't think I've ever used that. But now you know the Sanskrit name for standing splits. I'm probably still going to call it standing splits because I find that at least here, that's what most people know it as. Whereas certain poses like Virabhadrasana, many people know that that means warrior, whereas this Sanskrit name isn't as commonly used. Anyways, enough of that. Let's go ahead and get into the pose. So I find that standing splits, just like regular splits pose, is very challenging because it's a closed hip pose. In a regular splits pose, though, you're using the mat to kind of help you. You don't have the opportunity to really, quote unquote, mess up the pose as much because you're on the mat. Whereas when you're doing standing splits, it's really easy to get lazy, or not even get lazy, just unintentionally get out of the pose. Ideally, our hips are actually square here, which is why it makes it so hard. It requires a lot of hip flexibility on the back leg or the lifted leg, and a lot of hamstring and calf flexibility on the standing leg or the forward leg. So if I do a regular splits pose, Hanumanasana, which I actually cannot do because it just requires too much flexibility that I do not have. As you can see, the front leg requires a lot of stretch in the back side. The back leg requires a lot of stretch in the front side. So it's very challenging, but I'm using the mat here. The mat is kind of helping me, assisting me into the pose. Whereas when I'm doing standing splits, I don't have anything forcing me to keep a good alignment. So as much as I want to keep my hips square, it's really easy to kind of let this back leg lift up, open up those hips, and dump into the low back. So this actually feels kind of nice. It's relaxing, it's easy, I'm not really engaging a lot. However, that's not the pose. You can use a wall. A wall is wonderful to help you get into standing splits. You would basically be doing splits on the wall. So I'll kind of show you how you could do that at the end of this tutorial. When we do standing splits, we're basically in a forward fold with one leg lifted up behind us. So I like to actually start in a standing L, in which I'm going to grab a block out in front of me. I'll be standing on my right leg and my left leg will lift up behind me. Even in a standing L pose, it's easy for us to open our hips up to the left or to the outside. You want to focus on keeping your hips nice and square. What does that mean? That means my outer left hip dropping, the inner thigh lifting. Now, generally in standing L or warrior 3, I like to keep my foot flexed. However, I'm going to point my toes here as I start to walk my hands with or without the block closer to my standing foot. Now, as I do this, I'm starting to hinge forward, like I'm kind of crawling my belly down my thighs. I'm crawling my ribs down my thighs. Maybe I'll release my hands to the mat if I have the flexibility. Start with a gentle bend in your standing leg. The entire time, focus on that internal rotation of the back leg. So the outer hip has to keep spiraling down and the inner thigh has to keep lifting. So for me, this is actually my full pose. It really doesn't look like a standing split. What might look more like a standing split would be this. However, I can feel that my left hip is starting to rotate outwards. So I'm not really in the pose anymore. I still have to think about a little twist over my right leg as my left leg lifts, but it's the outer thigh that's dropping and only the inner thigh that's lifting. So I have to really squeeze into my back left glute. The lifted leg, the back of that leg is really working. So whereas in splits, you're feeling a nice stretch through the hip flexor of the back leg, here it's more of an active pose because I'm not getting that stretch so much. I'm really squeezing. I'm getting more of a stretch through the hamstring on the standing leg than I am through the hip flexor on the lifted leg, if that makes sense. Let's show that on the other side, and I'll actually show you from the front so you can see that my back leg isn't really even getting up that high, and that's okay. So I'm gonna start in a standing split with the block. I'll be standing on my left leg, lifting my right leg up behind me. My toes will be pointed, but I'm still focusing on that internal rotation. That means my outer right hip is dropping and my inner right thigh is trying to spiral up towards the ceiling. I'll start to walk my hands back. Think of a little twist over the left leg, just like you might do in a splits pose where you gently twist over the forward leg. I'm gonna drop my head as I start to crawl my ribs down my thigh and think forehead towards my shin. I'm pointing my right toes, but my inner right thigh is going up, the outer thigh is going down, so I'm really squeezing the back of the leg. I'm rolling my weight forward, so my right leg is nice and active, but I'm not necessarily feeling a stretch through the hip flexor. I'm feeling the stretch through the back of my standing leg. Some people even like to grab their standing calf or ankle and help pull down. Now, this pose to me is super challenging, but it's easy to make it look good and not engage. So it's easy to do the pose kind of lazy and not really get a lot out of it, even though it might look cool. So I encourage you to not do that. That's with many yoga poses. A lot of things look cool, but when you really focus on the alignment, you realize you might not be doing it correctly or safely or really just getting the most out of the pose. You'll feel a lot stronger and your body will feel a lot better if you actually do it the correct way. If you want to do this standing, now of course I actually have a bar right here, but I'm going to imagine I didn't have the bar and you might not even be able to tell with the camera. So I would actually start by kind of sliding one leg up the wall. So you can obviously see that the bar is in front of me, but I'm going to pretend the bar is not there. So I'm going to stand on my standing leg, and for me, this is pretty much all I'm getting. Of course, ideally, this lifted leg wouldn't be straight, so I would actually be probably more like this. And I'm going to start to walk my hands. But as I do this, I'm actually pressing now more into my hands, kind of like a handstand work. I'm still trying to rotate my right inner thigh down or up and the right outer thigh down to keep those hips square. The closer I walk back towards the wall, the more stretch I'm going to feel. To me, this is almost a little bit too intense in my left leg. That's my standing leg. So I might walk further away from the wall to start. Let's do that on the other side. Right foot on the mat and start to extend the left leg up the wall. As you do this, you still want to focus on the internal rotation of your legs. So that left outer hip, left outer thigh going down, left inner thigh going up. I'm actually pressing more into my hands, like handstand. Maybe I start to walk my right hand back a little bit, but I'm really trying not to compromise the alignment here. So if I start to notice my left hip opening up to the left, that means I might need to come a little bit further out of it. Eventually, I'll be walking my hands back a little bit more and folding more over my right leg. Now this, if anything, is a really, really nice stretch on that standing leg. So I really feel that through the hamstring, the calf muscle. This is a great way to learn the pose as long as you know what you have the body awareness to know when you start to externally rotate that hip, because no one else is going to catch it for you. You have to be aware that you're starting to rotate outwards. So that's really the most common misalignment I see is when you should have internal hip rotation, people start to turn outwards. Using the wall is a nice prop here. You can also use a block if starting from standing L, but I would say that most people are pretty able to get their hands to the mat. That's not usually the issue in the pose. The issue is getting the back leg lifted. So it's not super necessary to use a block in this pose, whereas in like standing L, the goal is to have your chest pulling forward. So the block is a little bit more useful because it's bringing the ground up to me. A lot of us don't have a problem if we're trying to fold getting our fingertips to the mat. So the block, not super necessary or useful here. the wall, a little bit more useful, but really it's a mental thing. You have to be aware when you start to rotate your hips outward. You can think about it again in splits pose. We don't want to be here and rolling open like this. So this is super unsafe on this back leg. If we're in standing splits, this would be my standing leg. My forward leg, right leg here, is going to be my standing leg. My back leg, again, what I commonly see is it turned out to the side like this. So obviously when I'm in splits, you can see that this is incorrect. But when you're in standing splits, you can't see, maybe someone's not spotting you. It's a lot harder to tell when you have misalignment. So again, I'd have to prop myself up. And then when I'm in splits, I can also think about this outer left thigh going down and the inner thigh coming up. Flexing the front foot like it's standing on the ground. Squeezing my back left glute like it's trying to lift, like I'm trying to go a little further into the pose. I find this pose super challenging just because it's not one of those poses where you're limited by your flexibility as much, whereas some poses like, oh, I can't reach my foot, so I can't really do the pose. A lot of people can do the pose. It's more that a lot of us are doing it incorrectly then. So being able to be aware and change it on your own is the challenging part. I definitely feel like I rambled a lot in this video, so I hope you got something out of it. I hope this was helpful. If you do have any further questions on standing splits, make sure to let me know in the comments. And I already forgot the Sanskrit name of it, so don't ask. It's in the title. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or other tips maybe that you find helpful in this, I would love to know. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for tuning into this posture lab, and I will see you again next week.